Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey man, how's it going?
It's going very well, and it's a pleasure to be joined now by Matt Christman. Matt is, of course, of Chapo Trap House, and also along with Chris Wade of Hell of Presidents on Stitcher, which came out last year. And it's in that capacity that we wanted to have Matt on as sort of an expert of the presidency. Which is what that show really is. It's not just about the individuals in the presidency, but also what the office means. Bring him on at this point to assess Biden up top. So you do a good job with Chris Wade of talking about when the individual is important versus when the sort of power is on rails. Give us, in that sort of context, your assessment of Joe Biden.
Well, Joe Biden became president because he was the only candidate who stood for a unifying symbol to the center of gravity of the Democratic primary electorate. He represented the party itself. I think what the party grandees imagined after Obama is that, oh, we have the new formula here for how we're going to keep the presidency. We're going to present a new focus group through primaries and through our media apparatus, representatives of new aspirational identity categories on the upwardly mobile college-educated side of the ledger, the people who can elect you in key swing districts across the swing states and all that. And that the primary was basically them trying out different models. Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg being two of the most prominent ones. Problem was no one was biting. No one cared because the context that had produced Obama had been replaced by this collapse, this falling down the stairs of the last 8 years since then that had just torn people's faith in any of those specific shibboleths. So the only thing that you could get people to agree on, if you were determined that they not agree on, hey, let's try socialism, which was the single presiding prime directive that organized everybody in the Democratic Party, both within its apparatus and the majority of its property-owning comfortable voters, were aligned on, and what kept them on the same page. The only thing they could agree on is the party itself, and a nostalgia for the last time they were in power, which meant the person of Joe Biden, the sort of old man mascot of the Obama years, who, of course, Obama and the top Democrats all knew by the time he was in vice presidency was not fit for the office of president. It made every effort to keep away from the presidency. They let the 2000 primary go as long as they did because they wanted someone else to emerge, and it just couldn't happen. So they very reluctantly rallied around him, and he has done exactly what you would imagine a person in that situation would do. They would be presiding lifelessly because he just represents a dead institution over the collapse of a political order that cannot be sustained anymore by the will of anybody in its structures. In fact, everyone in its structures now main job is not to promise something that they might imagine for their constituents in the future, but rather to explain why what is happening in the present to their constituents is not their fault. And that's him. He's the chief explainer. He is the excuse maker and chief. And as a result, he's wildly cartoonishly unpopular and ineffective, and will remain both until something intervenes with this deadlock.
But it's like the thing that's funny about Biden is like I like that term, like the explainer in chief, because like early on Matt and I were calling him like the press release president early on, because like Biden, something would happen and everyone would get really worked up about it, and Biden would put down this press release and be like, I understand how you're feeling about this. This is a very serious issue. And then when it came to what we're going to do about it, very, very little. And like it's Biden is like has been an interesting presidency, I have to say, to see how so many people, like especially like in the media, have reacted to it. And like obviously like mainstream media people are going to be saying one thing or the other, but like early on in Biden's presidency, there was this whole narrative about him that he was going to sort of reluctantly rise to the moment and be this kind of transformative FDR character. And despite like all of these huge moments, like from recovering from
that, by the way,
yeah,
a lot of the people who are very high on their horse about how there needs to be some sort of reckoning for people who supported the Iraq War how many of those people have some byline where they're talking about the FDR administration that Biden was presiding over, when all he was doing was shepherding the passage of a absolutely necessary bipartisan agreed upon stimulus project that Trump would have passed and would have earlier if Nancy Pelosi had not explicitly prevented him from passing it so that they could beat him in the election.
Yeah.
And that's the grist for their idea that he was going to be a transformative figure, even though he had spent the campaign telling them that he was not transforming shit, that he was going to keep things the way they were, and that he was, if anything, a caretaker who would get change, realistic change, by negotiating with a newly chastened Republican Party.
But
that was the promise. It was never that there would be any transformation. That was something that people who felt themselves sort of clammily associated with this just disgusting procession felt necessary to tell one another and their audience to exculpate themselves, because they're not immune from that need to let everyone know, including themselves, that it's whatever is happening is not their fault.
But like also like there's so much of that, I think, that like really showed how a lot of like the kind of more squishy progressive left liberal types, like their framework for thinking about politics was like looking at the number, like the line item, like how much is this bill going to cost,
right,
versus like looking at the historical moment of like how radical times we're getting, and the fact that like this right wing Trump was able to put forward, you know, one of the largest stimulus bills in you know, American history.
Right, like it is that the thing that he presided over, the bill he presided over, was simply just a continuation of a bipartisan approach to the pandemic, which had been throw money at it, most at the top, and as little as you can get away with at the bottom. And that was just a continuation of it. There was no additional. If you're having a new administration that is supposed to be allegedly critical of the crisis response of the previous one, and is in office with the assumption that it would offer a new and different approach to the crises that are multiplying, to just then get to call himself FDR, or have these mandarins call him FDR, for putting basically a cap on the end of this crisis moment. And then instead of advancing progressively, asserting the end of any kind of progressive frontier for the rest of his presidency, essentially saying this is it.
Could you contrast for folks some differences between FDR and Biden, both in like, I mean, as an individual, like a little bit, but also like the political structures that sort of led them to the respective tops?
Well, it's interesting. So obviously, their options in office are completely determined by the coalitions that brought them into power. And the coalition that brought FDR into power is this broad expanse of downwardly mobile America, you know, in a country that's never really been able to articulate class politically. You have the real stirrings of coordinated class power expressing itself factionally as the left wing of this popular New Deal front, which meant that the range of options that a president presiding over that coalition that's able to gain this sort of massive legislative majorities that they were able to gain is just orders of magnitude bigger than the options left to a caretaker like Biden after the era of mass politics had been fully foreclosed, after working class articulation in the Democratic Party had completely atrophied, after that class consciousness that can represent itself politically and culturally has been totally atomized, and all workers have been turned fully and finally into consumers. You know, it makes sense. You could not expect the same thing from him, and imagining he could bring you the same thing is a fantasy. But it is interesting that in addition to just having these different bases, you then have these two figures who are so different. Like in terms of intellect, you know, in terms of like piercing analysis and theory of politics, they're probably about the same. FDR wasn't a particularly intellectual guy. He famously had an interview with when he was elected with Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. at the Supreme Court, and after the talk, Holmes came out and he said about FDR, he said, second-rate intellect, first-rate temperament. And like that was the thing, is that FDR was basically the vibesmith of the New Deal. You had this huge riot of different factions with all these new ideas about what to do about this crisis, because now the zone of the political had been blown open and democratized by the crisis, and there were a bunch of voices to fill that void, and he sort of tacked between them according to what felt right. And obviously, it wasn't what you'd want from a maximalist socialist position, but from the point of view of somebody who wanted to save the American project, yes, save capitalism, but honestly, probably on the wide horizon, on a broad enough horizon, imagining capitalism being eventually overturned, euthanized, as Keynes imagined. And that's because the person of FDR is this incredibly secure 80 millionth generation Dutch blue blood aristocrat, the closest thing we had to a landed nobility. And with that, the security of that, equal noblesse oblige, which powered his politics and gave him the ability to do things like say after the business class, his fellow mandarins, or I mean, his fellow American aristocrats turn against him, he's able to make a speech where says, "I welcome their hatred." Because he had this other base of support in the broad American context. He's this fancy boy who was like, he probably wore a velveteen culottes until he was in his teens, and you had billboards in West Virginia for coal miners to read that said, "Your boss knows," or I'm sorry, "the president knows that your boss is a son of a bitch," and they would, and that meant something. Now Biden, similar mind probably in terms of policy and all that, but a completely different social milieu. He comes from that striving middle class that emerges after World War II, but the precarious lower rung of it. His dad lucked out. His dad was from the working class, immigrant Catholic milieu, makes it towards the middle by marrying into families that have more generational wealth, but then backs the wrong horse, ends up having to sell cars in Delaware. And his son growing up in this environment that is defined in distinction to FDR by precarity, but not by capitalist exploitation, not by the experience of a father on the line, or a father working with others in a union capacity, but the striving, lonely, hustling experience, the same one actually that Richard Nixon emerged from. And that background then powers him into this distinctly uncomfortable, grasping, cringing attitude towards the rulers of this country, a instinctive deference with the hope that they would basically let him in the service entrance, which they have, but only at the price of him never deviating from within very narrow parameters. And so, of course, that turmoil of the turmoil of the 30s throws up a figure like FDR, and this moment of just decline and specifically degradation of institutional legitimacy is going to bring up this shallow, empty, literally senile ward healer who has only ever known slapping backs and doing handshakes at VFW halls, who has never understood politics as anything other than a transaction, is going to now try to make a deal to achieve his apotheosis, which is being defeated in a presidential election. Like you look at some presidents and you're like, wow, this guy's destined to be president. FDR was destined only to be president in order for him to lose the presidency, because he's probably the most inveterate loser among our presidents to get to date.
And one last thing on Biden before David jumps in. What significance do you think it has? Because if I was a paid up Democrat shill and I had to say nice things about Biden every day, the thing I would emphasize is, well, look, National Labor Relations Board decisions are slightly better, and of course those are significant to the workers who benefit from the decisions. But what sort of, like, we're in the midst of a really impotent administration. What sort of vestigial significance do you think that sort of relationship has?
Well, you mean like the NLRB, or?
Yeah, I mean, because I think ultimately we all agree here, or at least I know David does, that it'd be nice to leave the Democratic Party behind like a chrysalis and have a Labor Party. The
Right.
Democrats still have sort of have that Labor on their corner. I'm just curious how you think that plays out.
Well, the thing is that organized labor, as it's currently considered, is absolutely hostage to the Democrats. It's not going anywhere. It can't go anywhere, just as the Democrats can't choose any other way to be. Like that's why. I mean, I know it's rich for someone who kind of got prominent by screaming at Democrats, but what I've really come to metabolize in the last couple of years is yes, they're all demonic creatures. They're evil in their function and in their own personal like desires. They see the world through a monstrous funhouse mirror, but they are also disposable. They are replaceable. They are fuses. They're spark plugs. And getting mad at them is like getting mad at those elements of the machine. Because if they did act differently, they would not get to the positions they are. If they started acting differently once in those positions, they would be replaced. So the union bureaucrats are stuck in the same institutional relationship that Democrats, that people within the party are. So that is why a lot of people have a hard time imagining, a third party, because if it's going to be based in labor, how can you see that occurring when the organized labor is unable to extricate itself from the Democrats at an institutional level? And I think the answer there, the good news and bad news, is that any of these intractable problems that you see is going to be resolved by the continuation and the furtherance of crisis and the deepening of crisis. And that, yes, that deepening of crisis is going to be dangerous and is going to be painful, but it is also the only context where new possibilities for political action will emerge. And I feel like that is why fundamentally a negative, depressed attitude towards the moment we're in that is fixated on imagining a break as an apocalypse, as a cataclysm, as the end, is really just an inability to imagine any kind of life with meaning outside of the very bare synthetic forms of self-soothing that we have access to in our current otherwise unsatisfactory lives. If we have faith that life continues past our specific homeostatic relationship to our environment, then everything opens up. The problem with that, though, is that it very much limits how much anybody in the social media or broader media sphere can talk about tactics and strategies and things to do and practices, because anything we're going to be able to agree to a vocabulary about is going to be beyond our actual day-to-day actions to change. We will not be able to influence by any specific individual act. Now, we can pretend that by doing something and imagining everybody else is doing it at the same time and for the same reasons because they were exposed to the same arguments in the same media that we were, you can imagine that, and many do, but it doesn't actually happen. Everybody is just going at it alone. Everybody is winging this right now. And the more that you are forced to fill in, the action items with abstractions, the further your actions are going to be from meaningful impact, and the more there's just going to dissipate into symbolic expression. Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It's a liminal space that we're all trying to float in.